The harbor smelled like salt and rust. Ships groaned against the dock, their wooden bellies bloated with crates marked in black ink, Olio d'Oliva. Joe Profaci stood with his hands behind his back, the wind tugging at the edge of his long coat. He wasn't a tall man, not loud, never hurried. He didn't need to be. Men moved out of his way, not because he barked orders, but because he never had to. He watched the crates being unloaded, slow, methodical. Each barrel of olive oil represented more than family business. It was a veil, a curtain drawn over the real work, the killings, the bribes, the shipments that never passed customs legally. And yet, it was always the oil people remembered. The olive oil king, they'd call him in the papers later. Polite, clean, a respectable immigrant success story, but even the oil smelled of blood if you knew where to stand. Joe wasn't born to wealth. He was born in Villa Bait, a dusty patch of Sicily where the priests whispered to God and the peasants whispered to each other. It was 1897, and Sicily had already taught him 2 rules by the time he was 7. Never forget who your enemies are, and never show your hunger. Profaci did neither. When he came to America in 1921, it wasn't to chase the dream. It was to build it, brick by brick, with grease and blood. He started small, real small. A grocery shop in Brooklyn where old Sicilians would argue over tomatoes and cigarettes and whisper about the man in the back who never smiled. Then came the olive oil import business. Nobody asked questions when his barrels came off the boat heavier than they should have been. And if they did, they didn't ask twice. By 1928, Profaci wasn't just importing oil. He was importing loyalty. Other families noticed. The Maranzanos, the Castellanos, even young upstarts like Luciano watched him from across tables filled with pasta and loaded handguns. But Profaci didn't want the spotlight. He wanted structure. So when the mafia wars of the late 20s burned through the streets like gasoline, he kept his family quiet, still made his money, still got his envelopes. While bullets were flying across rooftops, Joe was attending Mass, holding rosaries with hands that had signed off on men disappearing. And when the smoke cleared, he was still standing. Not just standing, leading. The Profaci family had risen like smoke from a quiet fire. And now it was the richest in New York. More money than the 5 families combined in certain years. Why? Because Joe wasn't greedy for attention, just control. He didn't rant. He didn't posture. He had priests on his payroll, judges at his dinner table, and killers in his church pews. When he spoke, it was soft, almost like a confession, but the room always listened. Still, even the quietest men leave echoes, and the streets began to murmur. Why were soldiers going unpaid? Why was Joe's olive oil business still protected while other rackets got raided? Why did some men never come back from meetings with him? Respect turned into resentment, slow, like mold growing behind paint. By the time the Colombo crew, his own soldiers, started grumbling, Profaci had already been in power for 2 decades. Some of them thought he'd gone soft. Old, detached, they didn't realize he was just waiting. Joe had time, always had time, but they didn't. And when you try to unseat a Don like Profaci, a man who built his empire between mass and murder, you'd better know what you're doing. Most didn't. And those who did, they died anyway. The apartment above the olive oil warehouse smelled like basil, incense, and burnt coffee. The kitchen was small, with copper pots hanging from the wall, their surfaces polished to a dull sheen. The windows faced the Brooklyn docks, and the seagulls never shut up, not even at night. Joe Profaci sat at the kitchen table every morning, same seat, same ritual. 1 sugar in his espresso, 1 egg, soft-boiled, 1 prayer. He didn't pray like a man afraid of sin. He prayed like a man who knew sin on a first-name basis and still dared to speak to God. His lips moved slowly. No theatrics, no chest beating. Just quiet words said under breath, like a business agreement made in Latin. Across the table sat Salvatore D'Ambrosio, his right-hand man, a former enforcer turned consigliere. Thick-necked, bald, and always chewing on a piece of licorice. He never liked coffee, never liked Mass either, but he respected Joe's schedule. You know who showed up at the docks last night? Sal said, not looking up. Joe dipped his bread into the yolk of the egg and said nothing. Frankie Schatz, with 3 of the Gallow boys. No crates, no invoices, just standing there, watching. Joe raised an eyebrow. He bring a priest? Nope, just bad cologne and a cheap overcoat. That told Joe everything. The Gallow crew had been acting louder lately, flashier, cutting in on some protection routes, sending their muscle through neighborhoods that had always belonged to Profaci. That didn't bother Joe. Ambition never did. What bothered him was noise, and Frankie was all noise. You think they're probing? Sal asked. Joe folded his napkin and set it down, looking out the window at the ships moored in the harbor. A gray gull landed on the railing and picked at a crust of bread someone left behind. I think, Joe said slowly, they forget who built these docks. He wasn't being metaphorical. Literally, in the early days, Joe had brought Sicilian laborers over to work the piers, long before unions mattered, before paperwork mattered, back when bribes could be wrapped in cigars and slipped into a dockmaster's hand without a word. Now there were young lions, slick with ambition, empty of patience, guys like Joe Gallow. Crazy Joe, they'd call him later. Men like him didn't want to build. They wanted to bleed what had already been built. But Joe Profaci wasn't done sitting on his throne. Not yet. The warehouse itself was a labyrinth of olive oil barrels stacked high, neatly labeled, clean. Always clean. That was Joe's rule. Clean warehouse, clean office, clean books. Everything smelled of olives and soap, even though sometimes darker things moved through it. Sometimes it wasn't oil in those barrels. Sometimes it was tools, weapons, bodies, wrapped neat, weighed down, gone before sunup. That's how Profaci operated. Quiet efficiency. He didn't yell at his men. If you didn't do your job, you disappeared. And no one ever found your shoes. Joe's office sat in the back, past a false wall behind stacked barrels. There, his desk was more of a chapel than a workplace. Crucifix on the wall, a photo of his mother, a cigar box filled with prayer cards for men long dead. A bottle of limoncello sat unopened on the corner. No one knew why. Sal walked in, holding a folded newspaper. Page 6, the feds raided the Genovese stash house in Queens. Joe didn't react. He took the paper and skimmed it. No names? He asked. Just initials. But it's a message. Joe set the paper down. Ignore it. Sal raised a brow. Even if it came from upstairs? Upstairs. That meant the commission, the unofficial, all-powerful ruling body of the American Mafia. Luciano had built it. Joe had helped fund it. Now it was filled with younger dons who thought Joe was too old school, too soft, too stuck in Sicily. But what they didn't understand was this. Joe wasn't trying to survive the game. He had become the game. Later that week, the commission called a meeting. Manhattan, neutral ground. A private club off Mulberry Street where the wine was cold and the air smelled like leather and cigars. Joe arrived late on purpose. Let them wait. Let them wonder. That was half the power. Mystery. Inside sat Carlo Gambino, thin-lipped and smiling like a snake. Tommy Lucchese with his crooked tie and sharper mind. And Vito Genovese, who looked like a bulldog that had swallowed a nail. You're late, Vito said, not hiding his irritation. Joe smiled gently. Forgive me. The Lord's work kept me busy. Carlo laughed quietly. Vito didn't. They circled the issue like sharks. The Gallow crew, Joe's own underlings, had been in contact with Genovese men, crossing lines, whispering about changes in leadership. Your boys are getting out of line, Joe, Tommy said, tapping ash into a crystal tray. It reflects on you. Joe sipped his espresso. They're not my boys, he said. They're children, and children get hungry. Control them, Vito growled. Joe looked at him calmly. I always do. But they didn't believe it. They thought he was slipping, getting old, getting soft. What they didn't know was that Joe had already made his move. Not through violence, not through guns, through money. He'd cut side deals with importers in Jersey, quietly funding Gambino's new port expansions. He'd sent wedding gifts to Lucchese's daughter, stuffed with bonds instead of cash. He'd helped bury dirt on the Genovese Capos affair that could have ruined him. Joe Profaci didn't fire warning shots. He made men owe him, and you can't kill a man you owe your freedom to, at least not without shaking the whole tree. Back in Brooklyn, the whispers grew louder. The Gallow brothers, Larry, Albert, and Joe, were holding secret sit-downs. They called it a reorganization, said Joe was hoarding the profits, accused him of treating the family like a kingdom, not a business. They weren't wrong. Joe did treat it like a kingdom, because that's what it was, and kings don't retire. They rule until someone cuts off the crown. Sal brought in reports daily. They're trying to pull in outsiders, he said. Bookies, small-timers, some union guys too. They think they can muscle you out. Joe leaned back in his chair. They can't. Maybe not, Sal said, but they can make a mess on the way down. Joe stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the city. I want you to send them a message, he said softly. Sal waited. Not violence, Joe added. Not yet. Just silence. Silence? Pull the envelopes. Cut the flow. Let them feel the cold. Sal nodded slowly. You sure? That might make them panic. I hope it does, Joe said. It's hard to shout when your stomach's empty. The next month was quiet. Too quiet. No money came in for the Gallows, no payments, no protection kickbacks. Their crew started to feel the weight. One by one, bars stopped paying tribute, bookies vanished, union reps ignored their calls, even the street kids changed alleys. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday, hand-delivered, no envelope, just a folded piece of stationery with Joe's seal, an olive branch crossed with a dagger. Inside, one line. There is no harvest without roots. The Gallows knew what it meant. Joe wasn't just starving them. He was reminding them who planted the damn tree. But they didn't back down. They got desperate instead. On a rainy night in early November, Joe was leaving church. St. Mary's, same pew, same priest, when a black sedan idled too long near the curb. Sal noticed it. Joe didn't flinch. A window rolled down. A gun appeared, but no shot came. Because before the trigger could be pulled, 2 men stepped from the shadows. Long coats, silenced pistols, 3 pops. The driver slumped over. The gunman screamed. Tires squealed as the sedan sped off without its shooter. Joe never turned his head, just made the sign of the cross and walked to his car. Sal lit a cigarette with shaking hands. They're trying to kill you now, he said. Joe nodded. They always were, he replied. Brooklyn, 1959. It had rained all night, that soft, endless drizzle that turned the city into something sullen and gray. Puddles formed in the cracks of the sidewalks, and the gutters flowed slow like clogged veins. The world moved slower when it rained, but Joe Profaci didn't. His office smelled like damp stone and espresso. The barrels around him seemed to shrink into the shadows, darker than usual. Outside, men still loaded trucks. Quiet men, loyal men, the kind who didn't need to ask questions. Across from Joe sat Father Giuliano, the family priest, or at least, that's how everyone whispered it. The priest looked nervous. He always did when Joe called him personally. They're saying you ordered the hit, Father Giuliano said, his voice soft, as if God himself might be listening from behind the crucifix on the wall. Joe took his time with his espresso. No sugar today, just bitterness. It fit. I didn't, he said flatly. But maybe they needed a reminder that I still could. Father Giuliano shifted in his seat. 3 men dead, all Gallow connected. That's more than a reminder, Joseph. That's a declaration. Joe stared at the priest like a patient man watching a deer wander into a trap. They came for me first, he said. They pointed a gun. They blinked. I didn't. The priest looked at the floor. I'm not confessing, Father, Joe added. I'm explaining. Meanwhile, the Gallow brothers were scrambling. The failed hit on Joe had backfired hard. Not only had they missed, but the retaliation came fast and precise. No flashy massacres, no blood in the streets, just sudden disappearances. No notes, no rumors, just names that stopped being said. Crazy Joe Gallow, the youngest and most volatile of the brothers, took it personally. He was built on ego and fury. Where his older brother Larry wanted strategy and Albert wanted diplomacy, Joe wanted chaos. He didn't want to run the business, he wanted to own the legacy. He paced in their back room on President Street, the same building their father had died in, penniless, unarmed, and invisible. Joe swore they'd never be invisible again. "He's choking us," Joe barked, like we're nothing, like we're street rats feeding off his scraps. Larry stayed calm, always did. "We push too hard, we lose everything." Albert leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We already lost everything," he muttered. "No income, no respect. Our guys are jumpy. 2 more defected this week," said Profaci pays on time. Joe's jaw clenched. "He runs this family like a fetching pope, all religion and rules, but underneath, he's a dictator, pretends to be humble, pretends to be holy, but he's just another killer in a suit." They all looked at each other, and for the first time, they said it out loud. Maybe it's time he stepped down. But stepping down wasn't in Joe Profaci's blood. He came from Sicily, and in Sicily, men ruled until death, whether by bullet or breath. You didn't vote out a Don. You either served him or buried him. That week, Joe called a meeting of his captains, all of them, not a suggestion, an order. And when Joe ordered, you showed up. The table was long. The light overhead yellow and cold. Cigars were lit, but no one laughed. Joe sat at the head, his rosary in one hand, a ledger in the other. "I hear whispers," he began, his voice calm, "that some of my sons are hungry, that they feel cheated. I hear that my way of doing things is outdated." No one spoke. Joe looked around the table. Each man he'd raised, each man he'd paid, protected, prayed over. Now they looked back at him like he was already halfway gone. "Let me remind you," Joe said, "what this family was before I took it from dirt and made it gold, before the olive oil, before the judges and the bishops and the clean records. We were rats, fighting in basements for pennies." He stood slowly. "And now? You wear silk, you eat veal, you sit in rooms like this while others scrub floors for rent." Still, no one dared answer. They didn't need to. Joe saw it in their eyes. Loyalty was slipping. That night, Joe didn't sleep, not even his usual 2 hours. He sat by the window in his private home, a modest 2-story brick house tucked behind a wall of trees in Bensonhurst. No cameras, just 2 guards on the porch and a St. Anthony statue by the mailbox. Inside, the air smelled like garlic and old wood. The walls were lined with icons of the Virgin Mary and saints who never answered their prayers. His wife, Nina, came into the room. She didn't ask questions. She just poured him warm milk and sat beside him. Their marriage wasn't romantic. It was a partnership. She kept the house clean, the dinners hot, the appearances perfect. But she also knew things, more than anyone else. "You're tired," she said, not looking at him. Joe nodded. "They want what I built. They want it faster than you gave it to them." Joe looked at his hands, soft now, no more calluses from hauling crates, but still steady. "Faster means sloppy," he said. "Sloppy means blood." She reached for his hand and squeezed it once. "You won't go quietly," she whispered. "No," he said. "I never do." The next day, something unexpected happened. Joe Gallow kidnapped Joe Profaci's top men, 4 of them, in one day. Taken at gunpoint from different parts of Brooklyn, tied up, hidden away. No ransom note, just a phone call to one of Joe's lieutenants. "We want to sit down, or they don't breathe next week." The street called it the First Profaci War. Newspapers didn't print it that way, not yet. But the neighborhoods knew. Murmurs in every barbershop, questions behind butcher counters. No hits had been called, but people moved like there were ghosts on every corner. Joe met with his most trusted men that night. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He wrote names on a napkin. He passed it around. "These are the ones we no longer trust," he said. "Find them. Talk to them. If they're with us, they stay. If they're not." The napkin came back wet with sweat and wine stains. No one argued. Joe stood. "I want them back. My men. Alive. Untouched. Tell the Gallows." If they're harmed, I'll treat the whole city like a battlefield." Then he paused. "And tell them this too. I've forgiven worse, but I've never forgotten." Meanwhile, the kidnapped men were being kept in a basement under a butcher shop owned by Gallow loyalists. The conditions weren't brutal, but they weren't kind either. No beds, no clocks, just stale bread and one toilet, and the steady drip of a leaking pipe that drove one of them nearly mad. The Gallows visited daily, asked questions, tried to flip them. "We can give you more," Larry Gallow would say. "Joe's got one foot in the grave already. Why die for him?" But Joe's men, old school, hard-shelled, never budged. One, Benny Mazza, even laughed in their face. "You think he's done? He built this from dirt, kid. He'll bury you in it." So the Gallows switched tactics. They sent an offer, a sit-down, at Our Lady of Peace Church, neutral ground, sanctuary. But Joe didn't buy it. "You don't make peace with a dog while it's foaming at the mouth," he said. Still, he agreed to the meeting. On one condition, the kidnapped men were released before it took place. The next morning, they were dumped outside a Brooklyn diner, bruised, hungry, but breathing. Joe sent a single envelope back. Inside was a photo of a lion, scratched and faded, and one sentence beneath it, "Even old lions bite. Winter 1960. Brooklyn's breath turned to fog. It was one of those cold mornings where everything hurt a little. Your knees, your lungs, your memory. Profaci stood on the front steps of St. Mary's after Mass, his coat pulled tight, the rosary still dangling between his fingers. He didn't look like a man in a war. He looked like a grandfather, a widower maybe, calm, reserved, just another immigrant whose bones ached when the weather changed. But the neighborhood knew better. People whispered behind their coffee cups. Store owners nodded in silence as he passed. A butcher bowed his head low and muttered a quiet Padre Nostro under his breath. They weren't praying to Joe, but they were praying because of him. War had a way of creeping slowly, like frost. It didn't explode overnight, not Joe's way. Instead, it spread. Quiet threats, shifting alliances, strange disappearances. The Gallow brothers had pulled the trigger with their kidnapping stunt, but Joe refused to react with hot blood. He was a patient storm. He didn't need 100 bodies on the streets to send a message. He just needed one, the right one. The Gallow crew headquarters on President Street had changed. The front looked the same. Cracked bricks, broken neon sign, the smell of old cigars wafting through the seams. But inside, tension rolled off the walls like heat from a boiler. Joe Gallow, young, wild-eyed, and louder than ever, had turned their crew into a bunker. Guards at every door, shotguns behind coat racks, metal chairs bolted to the floor. He wasn't sleeping. None of them were. "Still no counter-hit?" Albert asked one night, arms crossed tight over his chest. "No funerals, no blood. That's not like Profaci." Joe leaned forward, eyes twitching from lack of sleep. "That's the thing," he said. "It is like him. He's not playing checkers. He's not going to send some goons to shoot up our house. That would be too easy." Larry nodded slowly. "He'll strangle us with silence again." "No," Joe muttered. "Worse. He'll make us think we're winning." Profaci, meanwhile, sat in his back office, surrounded by the same unchanging decor. Saints, rosaries, and the low hum of a radio tuned to static between Catholic hymns. Salvatore D'Ambrosio entered with his usual scowl. His coat dripped with melted snow, and the ends of his scarf were frayed from years of nervous tugging. "We got word on one of Gallow's guys," Sal said, lighting a cigarette. "The redhead, Bruno Coletti." "Bruno's dumb," Joe replied, not looking up. "Dumb men make the best cracks. He's drinking heavy. Playing cards with the wrong people. Mouth's getting loose." Joe finally raised his head. "No violence, not yet. Just pressure." Sal blinked. "What kind of pressure?" Joe stood and walked over to a barrel of olive oil. He removed the top, dipped a ladle into the golden liquid, and let it run between his fingers like silk. "Let him get arrested, but make sure it's small. Gambling, maybe. Nothing serious." Sal raised a brow. "That helps us how?" Joe smiled softly. When the walls start closing in, even loyal dogs start barking. 2 days later, Bruno was arrested in a card room in Flatbush. Illegal dice, some dirty cash, and a sawed-off shotgun under his seat. Not a major bust, but enough to land him in holding. And while Bruno sweated in that cold, damp cell, a city detective whispered in his ear, "Profaci's got friends in the DA's office, maybe even your lawyer. You think he'll lift a finger for you? He didn't lift one when you were kidnapped either, did he?" The detective left the cell door open an inch too long, enough for thoughts to wander. Bruno didn't crack, not yet. But the seed was there, planted deep. Meanwhile, the streets were shifting. Small-time bookies and street earners began choosing sides. Some stayed with Profaci, older men who remembered the early days, who owed him their mortgages, their daughters' weddings, their brothers' graves. Others flocked to the gallows, lured by promises of profit-sharing, faster envelopes, and a new generation. But loyalty built on promises is like snow on hot concrete. It never lasts. One such bookie, Lenny Kuzo, a half-Jewish numbers runner with a stutter and a taste for horse races, got brave. He stopped sending Profaci his envelope, started sending it to the gallows instead. 3 weeks passed. Nothing happened. He thought he was safe. Then, one night, 2 men showed up at his apartment. Not to hurt him, but to stand in silence in the hallway just beyond the door. No knock, no words, just shadows. Lenny called the gallows. They didn't answer. The next day, he mailed his envelope to Profaci. No one spoke of it again. Joe's war wasn't loud. It was psychological. He froze the gallows out of the ports, made 2 of their garbage contracts vanish overnight. When they tried to muscle their way into a local bar that doubled as a numbers front, the owner had already sold the place to a Profaci cousin. A week later, it burned to the ground. Profaci didn't leave fingerprints, he left ghosts. In the middle of this Cold War, Joe held another mass. St. Finbar's this time. Tighter crowd, fewer eyes. Afterward, he invited 5 captains to dinner at his home. Homemade pasta, slow-cooked lamb, and wine imported from Villabag. It was less a meal, more a test. The captains arrived dressed sharp, polished shoes, slicked back hair, gifts in hand. Joe watched how they moved, who they looked at, who sat first. Benny Ruzzo, a younger captain, clean teeth, fast talk, laughed too much. Joe noticed. "You've been seeing Gallow's sister, haven't you?" Joe asked mid-meal, breaking bread. The table went still. Benny blinked, smiled. "Just talking, boss." "Nothing serious." Joe nodded. "Talking's dangerous these days." Benny swallowed hard. Joe reached for the wine. "You know what I like about wine, Benny?" "No, sir." "It tells the truth." He poured Benny a glass, red, deep. Benny drank it, slow, careful. But the message had been served. Later that night, Sal asked the obvious question. "You want him clipped?" Joe shook his head. "No. Let him walk crooked for now. If he falls, he falls." Sal lit a cigarette. "You sure about that? Might be a leak." Joe stepped outside, snow crunching underfoot, breath fogging the air. "The leak isn't the problem," he said. "It's who's catching the drops that worries me." By now, the commission was watching. Gambino had remained quiet, though his consigliere sent word to both sides. "Keep it off the front pages, no blood in the streets. Handle it like men." Profaci didn't need to be told. Joe Gallow, however, did. He was pushing harder now, calling Joe out in private rooms, calling him a fossil, a ghost. And one night, high on whiskey and ambition, he made his move. He showed up at St. Mary's, in a suit, with a bouquet of flowers, walked right up to the steps where Joe usually stood, and handed the bouquet to a passing nun. "Tell your boss I said hi," he whispered, then left. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't even a threat. It was worse. It was disrespect. When Profaci heard, he didn't blink, he didn't shout. He just asked, "What flowers?" When told they were lilies, he paused, just long enough. "Lilies," he said. "Funeral flowers." And then he smiled. But it wasn't warm. Brooklyn, January 1961. The snow had crusted over into dirty slush. It covered the sidewalks like cracked bone, and the wind cut through coats like it had a personal grudge. The streets were quieter than usual, even for winter. Nobody wanted to be out longer than they had to, not because of the cold, but because the city had grown dangerous in the dark again. Joe Profaci stood by the window of his Bensonhurst home, hands behind his back. He'd been there for almost an hour, not moving. The lamp on the table behind him cast his shadow against the glass, tall and silent. From here, he could see the garden Nina used to tend. There were roses buried under that snow, thorny, delicate things, just like loyalty. Behind him, Salvatore D'Ambrosio spoke without ceremony. "They got their hands on Russo," he said. Joe didn't turn around. "How bad?" Sal's voice was low. "Bad." Anthony Russo, one of Joe's more discreet capos, the kind who didn't talk much and knew how to keep numbers clean, had been cornered by Gallow muscle outside a bakery in Red Hook. They didn't shoot him. That would have been too easy. They beat him, took a hammer to his hand, left him crawling toward a payphone. "He's alive," Sal added. But the message was clear. Joe nodded. "They want me to bleed without dying." He finally turned. The light hit his face, just enough to show the bags under his eyes, the creases in his forehead, deeper now, heavier. "They think I'm weak," he said softly. Sal stepped closer. "You've held your fire too long, Joe. Everyone's watching. Even your own men are wondering if you still got teeth." Joe sat down slowly, like a man lowering himself into cold water. "I don't need to bare teeth," he said. "I just need to show the leash." That leash, as it turned out, was made of paper, not bullets. The next morning, 2 detectives walked into a midtown real estate office owned quietly by one of the Gallow brothers' shell companies. They weren't there to arrest anyone, not yet. They were there with questions about zoning, about labor permits, about taxes, the kind of questions that didn't get answered without lawyers, and didn't go away quietly. By noon, the office had emptied. By midnight, the Gallows were on the phone with their accountant, screaming into the receiver. Joe hadn't sent killers, he'd sent auditors, and in the underworld, that was sometimes worse. Meanwhile, Joe stayed in motion. Mass, dinner, prayer, and private meetings in the back of the olive oil warehouse, where he still kept a small wooden chair for his mother, who'd been dead for 30 years. It was there that he met with Don Carmine Sabella, an old friend from the Philadelphia outfit. Sabella looked like a man carved from old stone, wrinkled hands, clean hat, thick eyebrows like wool. "I heard the Gallows are making overtures to the feds," Sabella said without greeting. "They're stupid enough to think that buys them time." Joe poured him wine, Sicilian red. Nothing sweet. "I don't believe in time," Joe said. "I believe in timing," Sabella sipped. "So what's your timing tell you now?" Joe leaned back. "It's almost time to remind the city," he said, "that I still remember how to make people disappear." That week, it started. 2 Gallow associates vanished. Not high-profile hitters, but runners, bagmen. Gone without trace, no calls, no bodies, just silence. The Gallows hit back, small fires. Intimidation, a beatdown of a Profaci soldier outside a movie theater. They were trying to keep pace, but it was already slipping. Then came the next blow, not in the streets, but at the table. A meeting of captains was held at a quiet Italian restaurant in Queens, all Profaci men. But when Joe's consigliere arrived, 2 chairs were empty. Benny, Russo, Marco Calderone. They weren't just absent, they were in Florida, meeting with the commission without Joe's blessing. It was betrayal in the most old-school way, not violent, not loud, just enough to show they didn't fear him anymore. Sal brought the news with teeth clenched. "You want them gone?" Joe didn't answer at first. He just lit a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in years, not since the ulcers. But now, he needed the taste of fire again. "No," he said finally. "I want them broken." Sal raised a brow. "Broken?" Joe nodded. "I want them to lose everything before they die." The next week, Benny's mistress was arrested. Cocaine possession, 10 grams, enough to bury her for 10 years. 2 days later, her apartment was mysteriously ransacked. Nothing taken, but pictures missing. Pictures Benny had tried to keep quiet. Marco's restaurant, a fancy place in Bay Ridge. was suddenly swarmed with health inspectors. Roaches, they claimed, violations, shut down by Friday. Neither man had been shot, but both were bleeding. In the middle of it all, Joe sat with his wife. They hadn't spoken much that day. Nina had taken to praying more, lighting candles in every room like it would keep the death out. She knew what was coming. She knew her husband. Over dinner, she finally asked, "When will it end?" Joe looked at her. "Which part?" "The war." Joe wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, folded it neatly. "When the rats stop thinking they own the house." She stared at him for a moment. "Will you win?" He didn't blink. "I already have," but he hadn't. Not yet. Because the Gallows were planning something final. Not just another kidnapping, not just another beatdown. They were planning a hit, not on Joe, but on the entire structure. They called it the Blood Table. The plan was to hit multiple Profaci captains in one night. A clean sweep. A message to the commission that the Gallow name meant more than just noise. Joe caught wind of it from a young street rat named Louis Marino, a bagman who overheard something in the wrong bar and brought it straight to Sal in exchange for $50 and a promise he'd be forgotten. Joe didn't thank him. He just handed Sal a note, a list of names, a list of addresses, a list of funeral suits. Then, quietly, without ceremony, Joe left Brooklyn, not in the dead of night, not running, just gone. He flew to Florida under a different name, checked into a quiet villa near Coral Gables, under the care of a discreet Cuban nurse who owed him her brother's life. Sal stayed behind, ran the operations. The message was sent back to the streets. The Don is ill, but the family is not. Some thought he was dying. Some thought he was hiding. But the truth was simple. Joe was watching. And as he sat by the pool, sunlight glinting off the water, rosary wrapped around his hand, he whispered to no one. "Let them think I'm weak. Let them think I'm fading. Let them crown themselves kings." He closed his eyes. "Then I'll bury them like princes." Miami, Florida, early 1961. The sun didn't feel the same as it did in Sicily. Joe sat under a white umbrella by the edge of a kidney-shaped pool. He wore a beige linen shirt and dark slacks, freshly pressed. His shoes were polished. He hadn't stepped into a church in weeks. The water shimmered like glass beside him, but he never swam. Old men like him didn't swim anymore. They watched, in the shade. The villa was quiet, gated, bought with fake names and old money, traced through a shelf corporation in Nassau. The neighbors had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another retired businessman from up north, Italian maybe, with a soft voice and a firm handshake. But Joe wasn't here to relax. He was watching the storm from the eye. Inside, a Cuban nurse named Maricel prepared his pills, small white capsules, pink heart tablets. Even the olive oil he consumed now came in measured teaspoons, not generous swigs. "You look tired today," she said, placing the medicine on a silver tray. Joe gave her the slightest smile. "I've been tired since Mussolini was alive." Maricel didn't laugh. She didn't know if that was a joke. She sat the tray beside him and went back inside. She never asked questions. That's why she was chosen. Joe took the pills slowly, one by one, like sacraments. He drank water as if it offended him, and then he returned to his silence, just the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint thud of the pool filter. Back in Brooklyn, the Gallow brothers were under pressure. They didn't understand how a man like Joe Profaci, gone, sick, hiding, still owned the room, even when he wasn't in it. Joe Gallow especially had grown restless. "He's done," Joe spat, pacing across the back room of their safe house. "He's holed up like a rat, and we're still tiptoeing around like he's the Pope." Albert leaned against the wall, chewing a toothpick. "He's still got money moving, still got priests in his pocket, still got the commission listening when he talks." "He ain't talking anymore," Joe snapped. "He's hiding behind rosaries and palm trees." "Maybe," Larry said, quiet as always, "but we haven't won yet." That truth stung worse than anything. They had tried to bleed him out, but the body never died. His lieutenants were still collecting, still enforcing, still showing up to meetings in sharp suits with Joe's name behind every handshake. Even the newspapers had gone quiet again, like they were waiting to see who would win before choosing sides. And then came the news that changed everything. A phone call. Sal answered it in Joe's old office, alone. The line was secured, rerouted 3 times. A voice he didn't recognize gave a name he knew too well. Benny Ruzzo's been talking to the feds. Sal froze. Ruzzo, once a captain, now a traitor. Joe had already broken his legs financially, destroyed his restaurant, dug up his sins and left them on his front lawn like newspaper clippings. But this was worse. Ruzzo wasn't just defecting, he was snitching. Sal made one call. It didn't go to a hitman, it went to Florida. Joe heard the news over the phone with no reaction. He sat on the same lounge chair, hat tilted slightly over his brow. The receiver rested against his shoulder like a dead bird. "Are you sure?" he asked. Sal's voice was clear. "He met with a federal prosecutor in Queens. They're offering him protection." Joe took a breath. Not deep, just steady. "Then he's already dead." He hung up, didn't say goodbye, didn't slam the phone. Just closed his eyes for 5 minutes, letting the warmth of the sun press down against the top of his face. Then, without looking, he reached for the rosary on the table beside him. 2 days later, Benny Ruzzo's car exploded in front of a laundromat on Atlantic Avenue. No warning, no message, just a ball of fire and black smoke curling into the sky like incense. There wasn't enough left of him to bury. The newspapers didn't tie it to Joe, but the streets did. The message was clear. You don't talk about Profaci and walk away. The commission responded the only way they knew how. They asked for peace. Again. A sit-down. Not in New York, not in Florida, somewhere neutral, Chicago. Joe refused to attend in person, sent Sal instead. With 2 lieutenants and a message written in longhand, sealed in a white envelope. Sal read it to the table, where men like Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and Sam Giancana listened with bored eyes. This is not a civil war. This is pest control. I will not be negotiated with over my own table. I will not forgive traitors. I will not forget their names. The olive branch has been broken. The fire will come next. J. Profaci. Silence followed. Carlo Gambino sighed. He always was dramatic. Lucchese leaned forward. But he's still alive and still earning. Giancana smirked. Still Catholic, too. Sal said nothing. He folded the note, put it back in his coat, and left. The war began to burn again. Gallow men started getting picked off, not in groups, one by one. A driver found strangled in a hotel bathroom, a courier thrown from a rooftop, a bartender shot in the knee and left alive so he could tell the story. None of them led back to Joe, but everyone knew. Joe's hands weren't clean. They were just too far away to trace. Maricel noticed the change. Joe no longer sat in silence. He listened to the radio again. Old jazz, faint organ music, church choirs, anything to break the sound of his own breathing. "Bad dreams?" she asked one morning while changing the linens. Joe shook his head. "Not dreams." "Then what?" He looked out the window, his eyes darker now. "Ghosts." But ghosts weren't the only thing haunting him. A letter arrived one morning, hand-delivered, no stamp, no return address, just a single sheet of paper, folded once. On it, the words, "Come home, or we bring the war to your wife." There was no signature, but Joe didn't need one. He sat with it for an hour, didn't speak, didn't blink. Then he stood, walked to the small desk in the corner, and pulled out a pistol he hadn't touched in years. He checked the chamber, loaded, clean. Maricel saw it and backed away, frightened. Joe didn't look at her, he just said, "Book the flight." That night, he sat under the cross in the villa's small chapel, knees bent, eyes closed, not asking forgiveness, just reminding God that he wasn't the only one who remembered things. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and packed his bags. Joe Profaci was going back to Brooklyn, not for revenge, not for war, for closure, Because you can't rule a kingdom from a sun chair, and you can't bury rats unless you dig the grave yourself. Brooklyn. Spring 1961. The cab pulled up to the curb just before sunrise. The sky hadn't turned blue yet. It was still painted in charcoal, heavy with the smell of last night's rain and the lingering soot of garbage fires. The cabbie didn't know who he was driving. To him, it was just an old man in a dark wool coat with tired eyes and a soft Sicilian accent. "Want me to wait?" the driver asked, rubbing sleep from his face. Joe Profaci opened the door and stepped out slowly. He didn't answer, just handed the man a few bills and a nod. Then he walked across the sidewalk, alone. The house hadn't changed. Same iron gate, same chipped stone steps, same Virgin Mary statue in the front garden, its paint faded and peeling. Inside, the air was still. Nina had prepared the room, fresh sheets, rosary by the bed, a cross above the dresser. But she wasn't home. Joe had sent her away weeks earlier. She'd protested, but he insisted. "If they come, I need them to come for me." He sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled, slowly, like it hurt. He wasn't sick in the way the papers would later claim. No cancer, no stroke. He was just tired, worn down by the years, by the weight of a crown no one could see, but everyone wanted to steal. Outside, Brooklyn was waking up, but Joe Profaci had already been awake for a long time. By noon, the word had spread. He's back, not shouted, not printed, not celebrated, just whispered from ear to ear. Barbershops fell silent mid-conversation. Bookmakers paused before taking bets. Men who'd thought about defecting suddenly stayed put for a few more weeks. Joe Profaci had returned, and the streets felt it. Sal D'Ambrosio showed up first, walked straight into the house without knocking, coat still damp from the rain. "You sure this is smart?" he asked. Joe poured him coffee, black, burnt, bitter. "I didn't come back to be smart." Sal took the cup, sipped, winced. "Then why?" Joe sat down across from him. "Because they forgot." "Forgot what?" Joe's eyes didn't move from his. "That I'm not a ghost." The Gallow brothers were caught off guard. They hadn't expected him to come back. They thought he'd rot under the Florida sun or die in some quiet clinic surrounded by fake names and sad music. But now he was here, and his very presence was pressure. Joe Gallow, Crazy Joe, paced their apartment like a caged animal. Hair messy, eyes red, a cigarette constantly hanging from his lip. "Do we hit him?" he asked. Larry shook his head. "We do that. We lose everything. The commission still respects him." Albert chimed in. "We already crossed lines. We hit his captains. We kidnapped his men. You think they'll let us whack the old man without blinking?" Joe slammed his fist on the table. "He came back to die." "No," Larry said. "He came back to win." Profaci's next move wasn't a bullet. It was a dinner. He invited 5 of his captains to the same back room he'd used for 20 years. A small Italian restaurant in Bay Ridge. Candles on the table, Chianti in the glass, and the weight of tradition in every brick. The table was set for 6. Only 4 showed up. Joe didn't acknowledge the empty chair, didn't speak of who was missing. He simply toasted. "To loyalty," he said. "The only currency that doesn't lose value." No one clinked glasses. They drank in silence. Then Joe placed 5 envelopes on the table. Each had a name. Each had a target. Not for execution, not yet. These were informants, fence-sitters, bookies and loan sharks who had started paying both sides. "You choose," Joe said. "One each. Talk to them. Convince them. If they stay with us, good. If they don't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That same week, Joe called in a favor. Not from a soldier, not from a capo, from a priest. Father Giuliano, now older, more cautious, and more scared than ever, arrived late at night. Joe met him in the living room, lights low, hands folded. "I need names," Joe said. The priest swallowed. "I told you before, I can't." Joe raised a hand. "I'm not asking for confessions." He slid a list across the table. "These men took communion. You saw them. You know if they came to you shaking, nervous, you don't need to tell me what they said. Just mark the ones who've been restless." Father Giuliano stared at the list. He marked 7 names. Joe nodded once. "Thank you, Father." 2 of the 7 vanished within the week. One was found floating in the East River, wrists tied. The other moved out of state, at least that's what his wife claimed. But the streets didn't believe her, neither did the cops. But they never found the body. The remaining 5 came crawling back, hands shaking, envelopes doubled. They kissed Joe's ring. He let them, but he didn't forgive them. Then came the meeting request, not from the gallows, from the commission, again. Sal delivered the message. "They want you and Joe Gallow to sit down, together, with witnesses." Joe raised an eyebrow. "In the same room? Neutral ground, Staten Island, no weapons, no soldiers." Joe looked out the window. Rain again. The city never stayed dry long. "Do you think they'd kill me there?" he asked. Sal shook his head. "Not unless they want a war." Joe gave a cold smile. "We're already in one." But he agreed, on one condition: no press, no intermediaries. And Joe Gallow had to apologize, not in words but in gesture. He was to bring an envelope, not full of money, just a rosary, old school, symbolic. A way to say, "I'm not your equal, I'm your mistake." The commission passed the demand. Joe Gallow's response: "He wants a rosary? I'll shove it down his fucking throat." The meeting never happened. The next week, someone firebombed one of Joe's trucks. It was small, a warning. No one died. But Profaci didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because by then, the gallows were eating themselves. 2 of their men had been caught stealing from the cut. Another had been seen with a federal agent. Rumors of a mole spread through the crew like poison in water. Loyalty was cracking, even among brothers. Joe sat in his garden the next morning, coat wrapped around him. The roses were returning, buds breaking through the frost. Sal stood beside him. "They're coming apart," Sal said, slowly, but definitely. Joe nodded. "Rats chew at each other when the food runs out." He picked a dead leaf from the nearest plant and crushed it between his fingers. "I won't need to kill them," he added. "They'll do it themselves." But one thing still nagged at him: the empty chair from the dinner, the captain who never showed, Vincenzo Grasso, young, smart, connected to the unions, smooth enough to speak in both boardrooms and pool halls. He'd gone quiet. Joe knew what that meant. He was waiting, watching, possibly switching sides. So Joe made his final move of the season, not with violence, not even with words. He invited Vincenzo to his home, one-on-one, no soldiers, no threats. They sat in the kitchen, the same one Joe had used for 40 years. The table scarred, the light buzzing, the smell of garlic still clinging to the walls. Joe cooked, a simple pasta, oil, basil, pecorino. They ate in silence. Then Joe asked, "Do you think I'm done?" Vincenzo didn't answer right away. "I think you're close," he finally said. "Closer than you want to admit." Joe nodded. "I am," he said. "That's why I have to choose who buries me, and who gets buried first." Vincenzo put down his fork. Joe leaned forward. "You get one chance. Choose wisely." Brooklyn, summer, 1961. The heat sat on the city like a blanket soaked in sweat. Even the asphalt seemed to groan under it. Kids ran barefoot through fire hydrants, shirts clinging to their ribs, while men in white undershirts sat on stoops with their forearms resting on their knees, cigars limp in their mouths. There was a tension in the air, not the kind that screamed, the kind that waited. Inside his olive oil warehouse, Joe Profaci sat in a wooden chair, hands folded on his lap. A ceiling fan whirred above him, barely moving the humid air. The warehouse hadn't changed in decades. The barrels still stacked with precision, labels in perfect rows, each one whispering about legitimacy to anyone naive enough to believe in it. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Those barrels had built a kingdom, and Joe was still king, even if some pretenders were beginning to circle the throne. Vincenzo Grasso had left the kitchen without saying much. He finished his pasta, thanked Joe, and kissed his ring, out of habit maybe, not loyalty. Sal had watched from the other room, chewing a matchstick between his teeth. "He's wavering," he said. "You could see it." Joe poured himself a glass of water. No wine today. They all waver, he said. The trick is knowing who does it for survival and who does it for ambition. You think he'll flip? Joe didn't answer, because he already knew the answer. The Gallow brothers, meanwhile, were running out of time. Joe Gallow was unhinged now. The war had aged him faster than a prison sentence ever could. He barely slept. Every day, he sniffed out betrayal inside his own ranks like a paranoid animal. He even accused Albert, his own brother, of skimming off the numbers. I see the books, he spat. I see where the cash goes. Albert just shook his head. You think I'd betray my own blood for envelopes? Joe didn't answer. He didn't have to. Trust was dead between them, and not because of money. Because Joe Gallow couldn't stand the idea that Profaci was still winning without firing a single bullet himself. He's old, Joe said one night to his crew, pacing back and forth like a general. But he's poison. The longer he sits, the sicker we get. We have to make the commission see that he's the disease. Larry leaned back, calmer than his brothers. They already know. Then why hasn't anyone moved on him? Albert spoke up quietly. Because they're scared of ghosts. Profaci hadn't made a public appearance in weeks. He'd stopped showing up at Mass. Stopped eating at his favorite restaurant. Even the warehouse office sat unused most days. People said he was sick again. Some said dying. But then, quietly, a letter was delivered. Not typed, not sent through any formal channel. Just a white envelope slipped under the back door of a cigar lounge in Red Hook, a known Gallow spot. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The Don is not sick. The Don is not dying. The Don is deciding. No signature. But it was his handwriting. The Gallows were furious. They stormed through the lounge, flipping tables, screaming at waiters, punching their own guys just to feel in control. Because deep down, they were scared. They had declared war. But Profaci hadn't fought back, not fully. And there was something worse than war, waiting for judgment. The commission finally reached out again, this time, not for peace, for clarity. A letter came, formally written, stamped, signed with Gambino's name. We need to know your plan. The war is bleeding into too many pockets. Joe read it in his kitchen, then folded it neatly and put it into the fire without saying a word. Sal watched the paper curl into black ash. You gonna ignore it? Joe nodded. They're not calling for clarity, he said. They're calling for permission. And I don't need permission to bury traitors. That night, Vincenzo Grasso vanished. No gunfire, no public scene, just a silent disappearance. His car was left outside a hotel in Queens, his suit jacket folded neatly in the back seat, his watch still ticking. The body was never found. The message, however, was loud. You wavered. You paid. 2 days later, the Gallows made their boldest move yet. They hijacked one of Joe's trucks, full of legitimate olive oil, and dumped it in the East River. They let it sink like a coffin, barrels and all. Then they left a note on the dock. Maybe you can baptize yourself with that. Old man. It was a line only Joe would understand. They were mocking his faith, mocking his legacy, mocking the silence. Sal brought the note to Joe personally. Joe held it in his hand, looked at the ink, looked at the water damage. Then he tore it in half and said, "No more letters." The next morning, 3 of Joe's trucks left the warehouse, 2 decoys, 1 reel. They didn't carry olive oil. They carried men, quiet men, with gloves and knives and one clear instruction: cut the voice, not the throat. By midnight, Gallo's consigliere, Ralphie Caputo, had his tongue split open with a straight razor in his own kitchen. His wife found him crawling on the floor, bleeding but alive. He couldn't talk, would never talk again. The newspapers called it a freak home invasion. The streets called it a resurrection. Joe wasn't dying. He was reminding. That same week, Joe returned to St. Mary's, not for show, not for power, for routine. He stepped out of the car wearing the same long wool coat, same dark fedora. He walked slowly, but not weakly. People watched from corners. Kids froze mid-ball game. A priest opened the door and stammered, "Mr. Profaci, it's been a while." Joe didn't smile. He just said, God doesn't need weekly reminders, but sometimes his children do. He sat in the front pew, alone, said nothing, just sat with his hands folded and his eyes closed, a judge, not a penitent. The commission met again, this time without Joe. They argued late into the night. Some wanted to back Gallow, younger, hungrier, more aggressive. Others wanted the war ended at any cost. Only one voice, Gambino's, said what none wanted to admit. We can't back a man who can't kill a ghost. Back in Brooklyn, Joe sat at his table with Sal and a new man, Tommy Bellini, young, eager, sharp-jawed, a new recruit, not to the family, to the inner circle. Joe poured wine for all three. Then slid a photograph across the table. Joe Gallow, stepping out of a club in Manhattan, laughing. Joe tapped the photo once. I don't want him dead, I want him alone. Sal raised a brow. You want his crew flipped? No, Joe sipped the wine. I want them to leave him before he gets the chance to die. That night, envelopes were delivered across the city. Fat envelopes, with cash, with offers, with promises of protection and something rarer than respect. Forgiveness. One by one, the lower-level Gallow men started to bend. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like floorboards under pressure. By the end of the week, 5 Gallow associates had stopped showing up. 3 returned envelopes to Joe. 1 sent flowers to St. Mary's, and 1 disappeared completely. No blood, no funerals, just shadows returning to the place they feared. Joe sat by his window that Sunday, listening to the church bells. The garden had bloomed again, red roses, thick and full, untouched by fire or snow. Sal joined him, folding a newspaper. 3 more jump ship, he said. Joe nodded. Sal looked at him. You think Gallow knows? Joe didn't respond right away. Then, after a long breath, he said, He will, when he's the only one left to hear his own voice. Brooklyn, July 1961. The heat wasn't just heavy, it was angry. The kind of heat that clung to your skin like regret. Asphalt sweated, garbage stank hotter. The city's noise became a low, angry hum. It was the kind of summer that made people quicker to anger, slower to forgive. But Joe Profaci, as always, moved slowly, quietly. While the streets steamed, he sat in the dark of his Bensonhurst home, windows open, fans spinning above him. The garden outside bloomed under the weight of the sun. Thick tomato vines, basil in rows, and roses blooming red like old debts. Inside, Joe didn't speak much, because a man like him didn't need to. The silence was doing the speaking for him now. Across Brooklyn, people were choosing sides, not with words, but with silence, missed calls, unreturned envelopes. The war between Profaci and the Gallow brothers was no longer just about money or pride. It was about legacy, and Joe was winning it by sitting still. Crazy Joe Gallow, for all his rage, was burning through friends and foot soldiers like a match burns paper. His anger became sloppy. He started talking too much, accusing too many. At first it was strangers, then old friends, then even his own blood. You think you can replace me? He screamed at his brother Albert one night, drunk, throwing a glass at the floor. You think they follow you because they respect you? They follow you because I let them. Albert just stared at him, jaw locked, fists tight in his lap. I'm not trying to replace you, he said. I'm trying to stop you from bleeding this crew dry. Bleed it dry? Joe scoffed, grabbing a bottle of gin and drinking from the neck. I built this family from his corpse, from the ground up. Albert stood. You built it from his foundation. Don't forget that. The room went quiet, because no one had ever said that to Crazy Joe. Not out loud. Not until now. Meanwhile, Joe Profaci's kitchen smelled like oil and garlic. He was cooking again, not because he needed to eat, but because he needed to think. The clatter of pots, the slow stir of sauce, the measured grind of fresh pepper. It calmed his thoughts, organized the war in his head. Salvatore D'Ambrosio sat at the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled. His tie was damp with sweat. He never liked summer. Gallow's slipping, he said. He's accusing everyone now. Word is he slapped one of his soldiers in front of the others. That doesn't go unnoticed. Joe nodded, stirring the sauce. He's making it easier. Should we move on him now? No, Joe said calmly, adding salt. We're not killing him. Sal blinked. We're not? No, Joe said again. We're letting him die. Joe Profaci's strategy wasn't bullets. It was erosion. He didn't need to fight a war with corpses. He needed to fight it with doubt. Doubt was slower, but it stuck harder. It lingered longer. It changed loyalties in a way violence couldn't. So he gave his men a new order. Don't shoot, don't threaten, don't shout. Just disappear. Stop answering Gallow's calls, miss the meetings, send smaller envelopes, let his lieutenants wait 2 hours at the bar alone before realizing they'd been stood up. Not rejection, just emptiness. And the plan worked. Joe Gallow's crew began to shrink. Not in numbers, but in spirit. It started with Bobby Franchi, one of the younger soldiers, a good earner, known for clean books and tight lips. One day, Bobby just stopped showing up, moved his mother to Jersey, changed his number, and sent a message through back channels. I'm done being part of a circus. Then came Rico Mancini, a bookmaker in Sheepshead, the guy who once said he'd take a bullet for Gallow. One morning, he turned up in Queens, handing envelopes to one of Profaci's drivers. When Gallow got word, he flipped a table. He was on my payroll for 6 years, he shouted. Not anymore, Albert said flatly. Joe's eyes narrowed. I want that bastard dragged through the street, but they never found Rico, because Rico wasn't hiding, he was protected. Meanwhile, the commission was watching. They hadn't taken a side, but they weren't blind. Luciano's commission had been built to prevent wars like this from spiraling, but no one had expected the old man in the shadows to fight so clean. No massacres, no drive-bys, no innocent blood, just quiet moves, shifts in loyalty. Rats going back to the ship they tried to abandon. Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, they all saw what was happening. Profaci wasn't fading. He was thinning the herd. One day, Sal brought news. Gallow's trying to buy hitters. Joe looked up from his plate. From where? Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Word is he's reaching outside. Joe raised an eyebrow. Desperate men beg strangers for help. Sal nodded. We let this go too long. He might get lucky. Joe wiped his hands on a cloth napkin. No one gets lucky when they're asking strangers to fight a war their own men won't. That same week, something else happened. A young soldier, Tony Delacourt, 22, fast-talking, heavy on pride, came to Profaci's door, alone, nervous. He stood on the porch with sweat darkening his collar, eyes flicking between the door and the street. When Joe opened it himself, Tony froze. I got something to say, he stammered. Joe said nothing, just stepped aside and let him in. They sat in the same kitchen, at the same table. Tony cleared his throat. I've been with Gallow since I was 16. I believed in him. I thought he was going to build something new, you know? Joe stirred his espresso, not looking up. But now, Tony continued, he's losing it. He doesn't trust anyone. He talks to himself, sleeps in 3 different houses a week. Half the crew's already planning how to leave without ending up dead. Joe looked at him for the first time. What do you want? Tony swallowed. I want to come home. Later that night, Joe sat by the window, watching the summer lightning flicker in the sky. He didn't smile, but he said something under his breath, a whisper, not to God, not to Sal, just to himself. Let the rain come. Let it wash away the noise. But not all storms wash clean. Some bring the last flood. And in the shadows of Red Hook, Crazy Joe Gallow was preparing one final act, a desperate one, an attack so bold it would force the commission's hand. One final attempt to prove he wasn't fading, that he still mattered, that he could still cut down a king. And if he failed, he would burn with him. Brooklyn, August 1961. It was one of those nights where the city didn't sleep, not because it was restless, but because it was waiting. Even the air was tense. The breeze didn't blow, it hovered. Neon signs buzzed louder. Radios stayed low. Dogs barked at nothing. and in the corners of every dark alley, it felt like something was holding its breath. Crazy Joe Gallow was sitting in a one-room apartment above a boarded-up bakery in Red Hook, sweating through his shirt, staring at a map of Brooklyn taped to the wall. He had circled 5 spots in thick red marker. Profaci's trucking depot, his olive oil warehouse, his cousin's apartment, Salvatore D'Ambrosio's club, and finally, St. Mary's Church. Albert stood behind him, arms crossed, silent. Larry was pacing. "We hit all 5?" Larry asked. "No," Joe said, eyes twitching. "We hit 2. Let him guess which." Albert finally spoke. "And what do we do when the commission steps in again? You think they'll let us survive another round of this?" Joe turned slowly. "I'm not trying to survive," he said. "I'm trying to end it." That same night, across the borough in a quiet brick home, Joe Profaci sat in his garden, trimming his tomato vines. He worked slowly, deliberately, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. Sal stood at the gate, looking uneasy. "We're hearing chatter," he said. "The kind that sounds like noise before a hit." Joe didn't look up. "They're not smart enough to stay quiet." "No, but they're stupid enough to act bold." Joe clipped another stem. The smell of fresh tomato leaves filled the air, earthy and green. "Let 'em," he said. "When men act from fear, they reveal where to strike." Sal exhaled, frustrated. "You know we could end this tonight. I could have 3 of their guys hanging upside down under the Gowanus Bridge by sunrise." Joe stood, finally met his eyes. "And then what? Another war? Another round of revenge and funerals?" He wiped his hands on a cloth. "This ends when they end themselves." But Joe had underestimated desperation, because that very night, while the city tossed and turned, the fire came. It started with the warehouse. 2 Gallow soldiers, dressed like sanitation workers, crept into the alley behind Profaci's shipping depot just after 3 a.m. They carried homemade incendiaries, glass bottles filled with gasoline and dish soap, wrapped with duct tape and thick homemade wicks. They broke the back window, tossed the bottles, and ran. The explosion wasn't cinematic. It didn't light up the sky. But the fire that followed was relentless. The barrels of olive oil inside acted like accelerants, turning the structure into a molten golden inferno. By morning, it was a charred skeleton of what had once been the heart of Joe's legitimate empire. Sal burst into the Profaci home at dawn, soaked with smoke, covered in sweat. "They hit the warehouse," he barked. "Burned the whole Furtskin thing down." Joe was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper. He looked up slowly. "How bad?" "Gone. Barrels, paperwork, trucks. The whole fusking place is gone." Joe folded the paper and set it down beside his espresso. "Anyone hurt?" "No. Security wasn't on site." Joe nodded once. And then, for the first time, Sal saw something in his boss's eyes he hadn't seen in years. Fire. Joe didn't say much that day, but he gave orders, precise ones. No retaliation yet, not until the second strike. Sal raised an eyebrow. "You think there'll be a second?" Joe leaned back. "There's always a second when the first is loud and sloppy." He was right. The second strike came 2 nights later. But this one missed. The Gallows had planned to bomb St. Mary's Church, not to hurt anyone, just to send a message, a final insult, a line crossed that couldn't be undone. But the kid they hired to do it, a 19-year-old street punk named Vinny Black Sox Benelli, got nervous. He panicked, tossed the bomb into the church vestibule, and ran before lighting the fuse properly. It fizzled. The janitor found it at dawn, half soaked in holy water. The NYPD showed up, quietly, took the device, no arrests, no headlines, but the streets heard everything. And now, even the devout were furious. You could steal, you could kill, but you don't bomb a church. Not in this city, not in this life. Not with a name like Profaci. By the end of the week, the commission finally stepped in, this time with threats. A closed-door meeting was called in the Bronx. No press, no security, just the bosses, their consiglieres, and the stink of cigar smoke. Profaci didn't attend. He sent Sal, but he sent a voice recording with him. Old school, reel to reel, 20 minutes of Joe speaking in calm, slow Sicilian. In the tape, he laid out the war's history, the betrayal, the kidnapping, the disrespect, the firebombing. And then he said the words that changed everything. I will end this with words if I can, but I will end it with blood if I must. Either the commission handles the cancer, or the commission buries the body when I'm finished with it. That was his line. That was his final offer. Back in Brooklyn, the Gallows were falling apart. Albert disappeared for 2 days without a word. Larry had stopped answering calls, and Joe Gallo, once the loudest voice in the room, was suddenly talking to no one, because something had happened he hadn't predicted. His men stopped showing up. No notes, no farewells. They just stopped. A few went to Jersey, a few went silent. And three soldiers Joe had once made men with his own hand, turned up in Bensonhurst, handing envelopes to Sal. No conditions, no explanations, just a silent switch. Profaci had outweighted them. Sal walked into Joe's kitchen that night with a smile. Gallow's hemorrhaging, he said. It's like watching a dog try to chase its own tail before it bleeds out. Joe stirred his espresso, still calm. We still don't kill him, he said. Sal blinked. You're kidding. Joe looked him in the eye. No, Sal leaned in. You let him live after this? After the fire? After the church? After the fucking war? Joe nodded. Yes. And then he said the line that Sal would never forget. Because when you kill a man, you give him silence. When you spare him, you give him noise. And I want Joe Gallo to live a very noisy life. But the city wasn't done yet, because in early September, a federal indictment dropped, not on Gallo, not on Profaci, but on 3 mid-level capos from both sides, charged with racketeering, union tampering, and tax fraud. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough to spook the commission. Now the war wasn't just bleeding the streets, it was inviting heat. And heat was bad for business, so the commission gave its final word. The war ends now, or all family funding gets cut. No protection, no enforcement, no collection help, nothing. It wasn't a request, it was a verdict. Profaci accepted. Gallo refused. But the message was clear. Fight alone or die in the dark. And Gallo, sitting alone in a tenement apartment with empty whiskey bottles and a pistol on the table, finally broke. He called a meeting with Sal, not Joe, just Sal. A quiet sit-down at a neutral cafe in Little Italy. It lasted 6 minutes. Joe didn't even attend. When Sal returned, Joe was already in his garden. He looked up, calm. Well, Sal sat down. He's finished, he said. He'll pull back. Joe nodded and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. The war was over, but Joe Profaci had already moved past it. Because while the city burned and bled and betrayed itself over his name, he had done what no one expected. He sat still and watched them bury themselves. Brooklyn, October 1961. The war was over, but Brooklyn hadn't caught on yet. The streets still moved a little slower. Men still looked over their shoulders. Some bars kept their lights low at night, not for mood, but for cover. People didn't say Profaci or Gallo in public. They just said them or the others. The neighborhood had memory, and memory was heavier than fear. In his Bensonhurst home, Joe Profaci sat in the sunroom, wrapped in a gray shawl, sipping warm milk. The garden was nearly dead now. The last tomatoes had fallen off the vines. The basil had gone bitter. The roses were dropping petals, one by one, like silent countdowns. Sal came in through the back door, dropped his hat on the kitchen counter. You look older, he said. Joe smiled faintly. That's the idea. Sal sat down across from him, a manila folder in hand. The books are clean. Trucks are back on schedule, the unions are quiet again. Even the cops are shaking our hands. Joe nodded. And the Gallows? Scattered, Sal replied. Albert's laying low in Jersey. Larry moved back with his wife. Joe, he paused. He's walking around like a ghost. Joe stirred his milk with a spoon. "He'll live a long time," he said. "Long enough to remember." Sal leaned forward. "So that's it then? No retaliation? No message?" Joe met his eyes, steady and sharp. The message was the silence. That's the one they'll hear every time they close their eyes. Joe Gallow didn't leave Brooklyn. That surprised a lot of people. After everything, the war, the fire bombings, the collapse, he stayed. He just stopped being seen. He stopped frequenting the pool halls, stopped checking in on his old corner boys. He didn't go near the docks. He stayed indoors most days, reading books he didn't understand, drinking gin from a chipped glass, talking to himself like the city owed him an apology. There were rumors he talked to ghosts now, that he wrote letters to people who were dead, that he was planning something. But nothing ever came, because the worst punishment Joe Profaci ever gave wasn't death. It was letting a man live after he lost everything. Weeks passed. Joe returned to his schedule. It was like watching time rewind. Mass on Sundays, dinners with Nina, quiet meetings in the back room of the olive oil warehouse. No press, no flash, just routine. But something had changed. Joe had won. But he'd won differently this time. He hadn't bled for it. He hadn't pulled a trigger. He hadn't raised his voice. He had waited. And in that waiting, something broke inside him. Not weakness, not regret. Just a deep recognition that he was tired, not sick, not dying, just tired of the noise. One night, Nina found him sitting in the hallway, just sitting, no lights on, no music, no paper in his hand. She asked if he was okay. He looked up at her and smiled. "Remember when I told you I'd die at the table?" She nodded slowly. "I think," he said, "I already did, but I just kept talking." Meanwhile, the commission had moved on. New money was rising, Florida, Vegas, Chicago muscle-pushing into old territory. The five families were rebalancing. The war had slowed everyone down, and they hated that. Joe Profaci was still respected, but he wasn't consulted anymore. They feared his age, his silence, the way he looked at people like he already knew what they were going to say, and that was fine with Joe. He didn't want more. He just wanted quiet. But the world didn't stay quiet for long. November 1961. Joe collapsed in the garden. He'd been trimming the last of the rosemary. His knees buckled, his eyes rolled back. Nina screamed. Doctors were called. Priests arrived. Whispers flew. He's dying. He's been sick for months. The war aged him. God's calling him back. The truth was simpler. His body had caught up with his years. He had ulcers again, a weak heart, fatigue that wouldn't go away. He stayed in bed most days, ate broth, sipped water, refused morphine. "I want to feel it," he told the nurse. "I want to feel everything." Sal visited every day, sitting at the edge of the bed, holding old receipts, bank statements, news clippings. "They're calling you the olive oil emperor now," he said once. Joe chuckled. "Let them. Just don't let them put that on my tombstone." "What do you want on it?" Joe thought for a long time, then said. He waited, and he watched. December. One by one, men came to the house to kiss the ring. Capos, old soldiers, even enemies. No speeches, no gifts, just long silences. One hand held, one nod exchanged. And when they left, they all said the same thing. He's already halfway gone, but Joe wasn't done. He made one final move. He called the priest, Father Giuliano, and gave him a letter, sealed, stamped. "To be opened after my funeral," Joe said. Father Giuliano took it and never asked why. Because men like Joe didn't make confessions. They left instructions. January 1962. Joe woke early, drank half a glass of water, sat up on his own. Nina walked into the room to find him looking out the window. "It's snowing," she whispered. He nodded. "Good. Covers everything." "Are you cold?" "No, I'm fine." She sat beside him, and he said one last thing before the silence took him. "I waited. Long enough. Let someone else decide now." Joe Profaci died quietly, without fear, in his own home. No sirens, no headlines. Just the city breathing out. The funeral was small, tight. The commission sent flowers, but no speeches. The church held a mass, but no eulogy. Sal lowered his eyes and said only this at the graveside. He didn't lose. He didn't win. He just outlasted everyone. But the letter he left? It arrived at the Vatican. Weeks later. And in it, Joe explained everything. Not to confess, not to ask forgiveness, but to remind. He had given more to the church than most popes. He had buried traitors and priests in the same week. He had funded a cathedral no one knew about. And now he asked for one thing. Let me rest in ground that's been blessed, even if the dirt remembers blood. The request was granted. He was moved. Not far. Just far enough that no enemy could find him. And Joe Gallow? He lived 5 more years, louder than ever, angrier than before. But even he admitted once in a drunk interview with a magazine, Profaci didn't kill me. He did something worse. He buried me alive. Brooklyn, February 1962. The snow hadn't melted, but the streets were back to normal, whatever normal meant in a city where shadows still walked ahead of you. Joe Profaci had been buried for just over a month, and already the walls of his empire were showing hairline fractures. The truck still ran, the olive oil barrels still rolled, but behind every handshake, every envelope, every whispered phone call, one question passed from mouth to mouth like a cold. Who's the new Don? Salvatore D'Ambrosio sat in Joe's old office, a place he hadn't entered since the funeral. Dust hung in the air. The crucifix on the wall seemed to sag lower, like it too was tired. On the desk sat the old ledger, bound in brown leather, the corners worn soft. He opened it slowly. The names were still there, old names, dead names, and names that were waiting for permission, waiting for orders, waiting to see who would wear the ring next. Sal leaned back and stared at the ceiling fan. It spun slowly, clicking once every third rotation, the same broken rhythm as before. He didn't want the throne. He never did. But he also knew what happened when no one sat on it. A throne doesn't stay empty, he muttered. It just starts bleeding. The commission made the first move. Carlo Gambino sent a letter, short, sharp, wrapped in civility. We will respect the Profaci family's right to name their successor, but delay invites confusion. Confusion invites problems. Choose quickly. It wasn't a threat, but it smelled like one. Inside the Profaci crew, lines were already being drawn. Carmine Jr. Montemuro, a heavy earner with a clean face and dirty hands, thought he had the numbers. Young, media-savvy, and tight with a few West Side unions, he made the rounds fast, shaking hands, throwing envelopes, smiling too much. He's trying too hard, Sal said when he heard. Frank Donato, the opposite kind of man, quiet, gray-haired, priest-like in speech, also made his intentions known. He wasn't flashy. He'd been by Joe's side for 20 years, ran collections in Queens, and never once tried to be the loudest voice in the room. He didn't campaign. He just waited. The right men don't chase power, he said in one sit-down. They inherit it because they've proven they won't burn it. Others tried too, smaller fish. Men who'd never sat at the big table but thought Joe's death meant an open bar. Within 2 weeks, there were 8 serious contenders, but none of them had the one thing they needed: Joe's ghost. Sal began hosting quiet interviews. One by one, he brought them into the back room of the olive oil warehouse. Same questions, same quiet stares. What would you do about Gallow? How do you handle a soldier skimming 2% off the books? What's more dangerous, ambition or fear? Most answered like politicians. Junior Montemuro gave answers like a PR agent. Frank Donato answered like a priest. And then there was Louis Tarantella, a former enforcer turned shy union rep. He answered with the truth. What would you do about Gallow? Watch him burn himself alive. How do you handle a soldier skimming? First time, remind him. Second time, bury him. Ambition or fear? Ambition gets you killed faster, but fear lasts longer. Sal wrote down 2 words next to his name. Unpolished. Honest. That made him dangerous, but honesty always was. Meanwhile, the Gallow crew hadn't made a sound since the ceasefire. They didn't need to. Joe Gallow was back in the city, walking the streets again like he owned them. Not with power, but with spite. He had nothing to lose. That made him unpredictable. People watched him the way they'd watch a drunk man playing with matches next to a gasoline truck. You didn't know when he'd light it, but you knew he would. He'd stopped talking about revenge, stopped mentioning Profaci at all, but behind his eyes was something deeper than hate. Jealousy. He walked into Giacomo's Ristorante one night, alone, uninvited. It was a Profaci-friendly spot, always had been. The bartender froze. Joe sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, drank it slow. When he left, he didn't pay. Didn't say goodbye. But on the bar napkin, he left a drawing. A little stick figure sitting on a throne with no head. Sal got the napkin the next day, showed it to no one, just burned it in the kitchen sink, then lit a cigarette off the same flame. He didn't need messages. He needed stability. And so, 3 nights later, he made the final decision. He called a sit-down in the back of San Biagio's church. No soldiers, no guns. Just the 5 most senior captains, all seated in the pews like they were waiting for confession. Sal stood near the altar. No microphone, no papers, just his voice. "The Don is gone," he said, "but his ways are not." He looked at each of them slowly, methodically, as if counting more than faces, counting loyalty. "I'm not here to name a king. I'm here to name a keeper, someone who doesn't want the power, but knows how to protect it." They waited. Then he said the name, Frank Donato. The room was still. No clapping, no applause, just a few nods, a few glances. No one objected, because no one had the strength to. And that's when Sal added one more thing. "This isn't about surviving Joe's death. This is about preserving it." Frank didn't say much at first. He took the ring, kissed it, put it in his pocket instead of on his finger. Later at dinner with Sal, he explained why. Profaci didn't wear it to show power. He wore it because it reminded him how heavy it was. Sal nodded. "Let them think you're weak," he said. "That's how Joe outlasted everybody." Frank smiled faintly. "And when do I show them I'm not?" Sal poured more wine. "When they try to take it from you." Across town, Joe Gallow got the news in a bar. Some half-drunk associate whispered it while playing pool. "Donato's the new guy." Joe laughed. Not loud, not mocking, just a quiet, bitter laugh. "That priest," he said, "he'll be buried under his own good manners in a year." But he didn't move. Didn't plan anything. Because Gallow had learned something in the war. When you strike too soon, you die faster. But when you wait too long, you forget why you wanted to strike. And Gallow was starting to forget. Meanwhile, Frank Donato got to work. No fanfare, no new suits, no sweeping changes, just routine. He walked the docks, sat with union reps, made peace with the last 2 defectors, paid Sal's son's wedding expenses, quiet power. He went to mass, sat in the 2nd row, same spot Joe Profaci used to sit, and every week he laid 1 rose on Joe's grave. No one asked him to. He never missed. But there were still ghosts in the corners. Unpaid debts, old grudges, new names. And in the quiet of his home one night, Frank found a note on his pillow, a single word printed in block letters, "Caretaker." He showed it to Sal. Sal didn't flinch. "That's all you'll ever be to some of them." Frank stared at the note for a long time. "Good," he finally said, "because kings die, but caretakers stay behind and clean the blood." Brooklyn, March 1962. Power doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes undesired, like a dog that follows you home and won't leave. Frank Donato hadn't asked to be Don. He hadn't campaigned, threatened, or whispered in dark rooms. He just waited, like Profaci had. And in the end, the title fell on him the same way it falls on most men who know what it costs. Not like a crown, but like a coffin lid. The captains called him Donato now, not Frank. The ring was in his pocket, not on his finger. and still they looked at him like they were waiting for a decision he hadn't made yet. He ran things the way Joe would have wanted. Steady books, slow money, tight mouths. But there was one thing he couldn't copy, no matter how hard he tried. Joe Profaci's fear factor. Profaci never had to yell. He didn't have to hit. Just being in the room with him made a man second-guess his own heartbeat. Donato didn't have that. He had respect, but not fear. And he could feel the difference every time a soldier hesitated before kissing his hand. Every time a street runner called him boss with a smile instead of a bowed head. It was subtle, but it was there, like a bad note in an otherwise perfect song. Sal noticed it too. He stayed close, watching Frank like a bodyguard watches a prince, respectfully, but with the grim knowledge that this kid ain't bulletproof. He's smart, Sal told one of the older capos, but he's got clean shoes. And clean shoes don't scare rats. He'll learn, the capo replied. Or he'll die clean, Sal muttered. In the first weeks of Donato's reign, money stabilized. Envelopes returned to full weight. The docks ran smooth. Bookies were back on schedule, but it didn't feel like order. It felt like a pause, like everyone was holding their breath, because in the shadows, something was stirring. And its name hadn't been said aloud since the war. Joe Gallow. He was back in the bars, but only the dirty ones. Places where cops didn't drive by. Places with broken stools and roaches behind the jukebox. He wore sunglasses inside now, even at night. And he smiled too wide, like a man who'd survived his own execution and wanted you to know it. They gave the throne to a choir boy, he said one night to a low-level earner. A goddamn altar boy with a receipt book and a priest's handshake. The kid nodded nervously. Donato's trying to hold up a house built by a killer, Joe added. And he ain't got the arms for it. Then he leaned in. But I do. The kid said nothing, because he knew what everyone else did. Joe Gallow wasn't trying to rebuild. He was trying to haunt. Back at the warehouse, Donato received an envelope. No stamp, no signature, just a single black and white photo inside. It was the side of his house, taken from across the street. At night, through the window you could see his wife and daughter at the dinner table. Donato looked at it for a long time. Didn't speak. Didn't call Sal. Didn't react. He folded the photo, burned it in a dish, and flushed the ashes. But he didn't sleep that night. Sal found out anyway. He always did. You want me to send a message? He asked, standing in Donato's office the next morning. Frank shook his head. That's what he wants. If I react, he wins. Sal snorted. If you don't react, you bleed. Frank sipped his espresso. Bitter, no sugar. Lately, everything had tasted bitter. He wants me to become Profaci, Frank said. But I'm not, Joe. I don't want to rule with fear. You don't get to pick, Sal said. That chair makes you choose. A week later, someone shot at Donato's car. Not a hit, just a warning. 2 slugs into the side panel while it was parked. No one inside, no witnesses, no leads, but everyone knew. Frank got the call while he was in church, kneeling, hands clasped tight. He didn't flinch, didn't look up, just whispered something to the cross in front of him. Not a prayer, a reminder. You said I was only the caretaker. The next morning, Frank changed, not in appearance, but in presence. He walked into the warehouse wearing the same old coat, but this time, he looked each captain in the eye for exactly 3 seconds. No smile, no handshake. And in that silence, something shifted. They saw Profaci's ghost in him for the first time, and for some, that was enough. For others, it made them scared enough to plan again. Sal took care of one of the whispers. A guy named Tony Esposito, mid-level, loud-mouthed, always trying to prove he was tougher than his wallet. Tony had been talking in a bar in Queens, telling the bartender he was thinking about switching sides, saying Gallow might start moving again. Sal didn't wait. He met Tony in a parking lot behind a dry cleaner. No warning, just a bullet through the cheek, not fatal, but enough to send a message. When Tony woke up in the hospital, he was missing half his teeth and couldn't speak straight. He never talked about Gallow again. Frank didn't thank Sal, didn't scold him either, just said, "Make sure the next one's quieter." Sal raised an eyebrow. You sure you're not becoming him? Frank looked down at his hands. They won't let me be anything else. Then came the invitation. From Carlo Gambino. Hand-delivered, a formal dinner, all 5 family heads, no agenda listed. Just a line. Let's talk about what's next. Frank stared at it. This was the table Profaci used to dominate without saying more than 10 words. This was the table where men were crowned or carved. Sal looked at the note and exhaled. They want to see if you'll break. The dinner was held at a private club in Manhattan. Velvet curtains, polished floors, silverware that had never touched anything cheaper than veal. Frank arrived in a black suit flanked by 2 men. No bodyguards, just presence. He didn't drink, didn't eat. He listened. Lucchese made small talk. Bonanno told a joke. Gambino, as always, smiled too much, but said too little. Then, halfway through the second course, Carlo leaned in. So, he said softly, how's the weight of that chair? Frank looked at him, calm. I don't sit in it, I just keep it warm. Gambino laughed, genuinely. Smart, he said. Too many try to wear the crown. They forget what happened to Caesar. Frank nodded. Or they forget who held the knife. That night, as the city blinked its way into silence, Frank stood outside the warehouse alone. No coat, no hat, just him, the wind, and the skyline. Sal stepped out beside him. Everything okay? Frank nodded slowly. They respect me, but they don't fear you, Sal said. Frank smiled for the first time in weeks. Good. That's how Joe started, before he taught them why they should. But Gallow was still out there, still waiting, still whispering. And Frank knew that as long as he drew breath, the ghost of the war would never die. Which is why, the next morning, Frank sat at his desk and opened a drawer Joe Profaci hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside was a sealed envelope, his name on it, Frank Donato. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of paper and one sentence. One day, you'll have to choose who lives for the family and who dies by it. Frank read it twice, then folded it and put it in his inner coat pocket next to his heart. Because now the war was inside him. Brooklyn, April 1962. Frank Donato had always been described with soft words, reliable, measured, polite. He wore good shoes, ironed collars, and carried himself with the kind of restraint that made men respect him, but never fear him. That was fine when Joe Profaci was alive. You didn't need to be dangerous when someone else was. But now, the old lion was in the ground, and the jackals were sniffing around again. They weren't attacking, not yet. But they were watching, from corners, from stoops, from behind cash registers and pool tables. And that was worse. It meant they were measuring him, not for admiration, but to see how deep to stab when the time came. Sal had warned him weeks ago, it's not enough to keep things running. You have to remind them you can shut it all down. At the time, Frank didn't want to believe it. He thought the war was over. But wars don't end. They just change form. And the next one would be about whether he deserved to sit where Profaci once did. The first blow came quietly. One of Donato's trucks, not carrying olive oil but contraband cigarettes and cash, was hijacked just outside Red Hook. No blood spilled, no cops called. Just a driver tied up and left on the curb, and a trailer full of product gone like dust in the wind. The message wasn't loud, but it was clear. You're not Joe. Frank got the call mid-morning. He didn't curse, didn't slam anything. He just sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling fan spinning above him, that same broken click rhythm from Joe's office. Sal came in minutes later. You want me to find out who did it? He asked. No, Frank said calmly. I want you to find out who knew it would happen and didn't tell me. Sal raised an eyebrow. You think it was internal? Frank didn't blink. Everything's internal. Meanwhile, the men were watching him, the captains. Frank had inherited them, some loyal, some quiet, some quietly looking to jump ship if they smelled weakness. At a sit-down 2 nights later, Frank sat at the head of a long table in the back room of Giovanni's. a restaurant Joe Profaci once ran out of a fake butcher shop. The atmosphere was different now, less sacred, more tense. He looked at the men one by one as plates of pasta were cleared. Then he spoke. "You think I don't know you're waiting to see if I bleed?" The room went silent. "But let me remind you," he continued, "I didn't ask for this seat. I took it. I took it because the man who built this family looked at all of you and decided I was the only one who wouldn't use it for glory." He leaned in. "So if any of you are thinking of carving up my piece of the pie, just know this, I won't kill you with bullets." Pause. "I'll kill you with distance, with coldness, with silence." He stood, slow and calm. "You won't die, you'll just stop existing. And that's worse." The room stayed quiet, and for the first time, he saw fear. Not in every man's eyes, but in enough. It was a start. But power comes with a curse. You stop sleeping. Frank started staying up later, reading old ledgers. Old notes Joe had written in the margins of meeting minutes. Scribbles like, "Never let a capo talk longer than 5 minutes," or "Pay the priest before the confession, not after." The margins became scripture. The lines between legacy and paranoia began to blur. Nina noticed first. "You haven't eaten dinner at the table in 4 nights, she said one evening, setting his plate down anyway. Frank didn't look up from his papers. I'm not hungry." She stood there a moment, then asked quietly, "Are you becoming him?" Frank finally looked up, and for once, he didn't answer. Outside the home, Joe Gallow was beginning to rise again, not loud, not flashy, but deliberately. He was recruiting, not with promises of glory, but with something more dangerous, bitterness, disgruntled ex-Profaci guys, street-level nobodies, ex-cons with vendettas and nothing left to lose. He wasn't building a family. He was building a funeral procession, and Frank knew it. Sal brought the file to him one evening. 3 soldiers, 2 associates. They'd been seen talking to Gallow in Clinton Hill. Frank flipped through the file, recognized the names. He closed it, sighed. "Tell them to come to the warehouse tomorrow night. Tell them I want to talk." Sal nodded. "You gonna ask them?" Frank shook his head. "No." "You gonna threaten them?" "No." Sal squinted. "Then what?" Frank looked out the window. "I'm gonna give them the rope." They came, all 5 of them, sat in a line like schoolboys being called to the principal. Frank didn't look angry. He didn't look anything. He offered wine. One declined. He marked that. Then he leaned forward and said this, "I know you've been talking to Joe." They froze. "I'm not angry." They stayed silent. "I just want you to be sure. Because the next time I look at you, if I even feel uncertainty, I'll turn my back, and you'll disappear." He stood. "You won't know when. You won't know how. You'll just stop waking up." He nodded toward the door. "You can leave, or you can stay, but you don't get to do both." They left. 2 stayed in the family. 3 vanished within the month. Rumors said 1 turned up in Philly, another in a ditch off the Belt Parkway. The 3rd, no one saw him again. Frank never spoke of it, but he started wearing darker suits, thicker coats. He changed how he walked, slower, more deliberate. Even his silence felt heavier. And when he did speak, the men leaned forward. Because now, they weren't sure what kind of man they were looking at. One night, Sal found him staring at Profaci's old ledger. "What are you looking for?" he asked. Frank didn't look up. "I want to know when he changed." "Who?" "Joe?" Sal sat. "He didn't change." Frank raised an eyebrow. Sal continued. "He just stopped apologizing for who he was." And that was it. Frank Donato, the quiet man, the clean-handed caretaker, stopped apologizing. He started making unannounced visits to crews in Queens. He sat down with union heads instead of sending emissaries. He told one captain in Manhattan to stop skimming, face to face, without a raised voice, and the man resigned the next morning. He refused interviews, refused cameras, refused credit. Because the family didn't need a celebrity. They needed a shadow, a structure, a man who could disappear and still be feared in the dark. Then came the final test. A Gallow associate, a punk named Luca Bianco, mid-20s, all leather jackets and broken teeth, tried to extort one of Donato's smaller crews in Staten Island. Claimed Joe Gallow was the real boss now. Tried to collect. He was caught, dragged into a basement. Frank was notified. Sal offered to handle it. Frank said no. "I'll go." He walked into that basement like it was church. No shouting, no dramatics. Just him, Luca, and two silent watchers. Frank stood in front of the chair where the kid was tied. Luca spit at his feet. Frank looked down at the spit, then back at the kid. "You believe Joe Gallow's the real boss?" Luca didn't answer. Frank nodded, took off his coat, then his watch, then rolled up his sleeves. He didn't hit the kid, didn't even touch him. He just leaned in and whispered something that no one else ever heard. Luca started crying. By morning, he had vanished. Some said he changed names and moved to Kansas. Others said he swallowed a bullet 2 towns over. But what mattered? Was that no one ever tried to collect on Donato's territory again? That was the moment. The moment the family stopped calling him the caretaker, they started calling him Don Donato, not because he demanded it, but because they believed it. And Frank? He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just sat back in the old chair, looked at Sal, and said, "I think I've stopped apologizing." Brooklyn, May 1962. The family had stopped whispering. That was how Frank Donato knew things had changed. When Joe Profaci was alive, the silence came from respect. No one dared ask questions because they knew the answers would come, eventually, with interest. When Frank took over, the silence had turned soft, uncertain, watchful. Now, it was a silence laced with fear. Men bowed when they spoke to him. Even Sal started knocking before walking into a room. Envelopes came earlier than expected, often thicker than they needed to be. No one tested the rules anymore. No one even approached them. Frank had arrived. But power doesn't come without a cost. And now the whispers were gone. So were the warnings. It was a Thursday afternoon when Father Giuliano stopped by the warehouse. He didn't come with sermons. He came with a cigarette he never lit and a quiet look in his eyes that said this wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. Frank met him in the back office. Same fan. Same stale air. Same old crucifix on the wall Joe had once chosen with his own hand. Father Giuliano sat slowly. "You prayed more when you were afraid," he said. Frank offered him coffee. The priest refused. "I'm not afraid anymore," Frank replied. "Then you've forgotten something important." Frank leaned forward. "And what's that?" The priest looked at him for a long time. "That fear keeps you human." That night, Frank sat in his kitchen, alone, with an untouched plate of pasta cooling beside him. He thought about the old ledger. He thought about Joe. He thought about how the only thing worse than being underestimated was being overestimated, because once men feared you too much, they stopped telling you the truth. And truth, in his world, was the only thing that could stop a knife in the dark. The knife came that weekend. Paulie Bellino, one of Donato's quietest soldiers, a man who once held Profaci's coat during winter masses, turned up in a dumpster behind a laundromat on Coney Island. 2 shots to the face, 1 in the gut, wallet untouched, gun missing. The cops said, "Random robbery." Frank said nothing is random in this life. Sal broke the news. He was clean, he said. Never spoke out, never missed a payment. Frank nodded slowly. Someone wanted to send a message. "Who?" Sal asked. Frank didn't answer. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the garden. The roses were blooming again. Blood red, almost prophetic. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. No name, no return address. Inside, a copy of Paulie's funeral announcement folded around a playing card. The King of Hearts, torn in half. Frank stared at it for a long time. "You know what it means?" Sal asked. Frank nodded once. "It means someone thinks I've gone soft." He didn't react publicly. Quietly, Frank reshuffled the deck. He pulled in 2 trusted men from upstate, Arnie Three-Tooth Malvone and Leo Santarelli, ex-enforcers turned crew bosses, men who had made their bones back when making your bones meant a shovel and a quiet patch of dirt near the docks. He gave no speeches, no warnings. He just told them, "Someone's playing games. You find them before I stop pretending to be patient." The search began quietly. Bars, back alleys, union halls, poker games, truck stops. The whispers returned, not about Donato, but about who might be next. People started avoiding phones, meetings moved to parks, even Gallow's side went quiet, like someone had flipped a switch in the streets. It didn't feel like war. It felt like calm before something worse. A week later, Arnie came back with a name, Dominic Iazone, mid-level, respected, too respected. He hadn't spoken out, but he hadn't kissed the ring either, hadn't paid full for months, hadn't returned a call from Frank's office in 10 days, and more importantly, he hadn't shown up to Paulie's funeral. Sal called it out immediately. "Paulie helped raise the guy," Frank nodded. "Then let's remind him who buried him." They found Dominic in a steakhouse in Queens, surrounded by 3 of his boys. Frank didn't send hitters. He sent a driver, who walked right in, placed an envelope on the table, and walked out. Inside was a photo of Dominic and Paulie from 1957, and underneath it, a card, the King of Hearts taped back together with a single line, "You dropped something." Dominic disappeared the next day. No note, no body, just gone. And Frank? He didn't ask where he went. He just crossed off the name. Power returned. The streets softened again. The captain stopped second-guessing. Even Sal, one morning over coffee, said, "Feels like the weight's back in your hands." Frank stirred his cup. "No sugar." "I'm not holding it," he said. Sal frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm just balancing it, waiting for it to fall." Because Frank knew something no one else did. Joe's ledger wasn't finished. He'd found a final page, hidden between glued sheets, faded, written in pencil. It said, "The king dies when the men around him become too quiet." And now, no one spoke unless spoken to. No one knocked unless summoned. No one said Frank's name unless whispering. It wasn't loyalty, it was survival. And Frank hated it. Because now, he was Joe. And he finally understood the curse of the throne. So he made a plan, one only Sal knew about. Eventually, Frank said, "I'm going to step down." Sal looked stunned. "Step down?" Frank nodded. "But not now, not soon. When the house is clean, when the bones are buried, when the whispers stop being about whether I'm dangerous and start being about whether I'm real." Sal exhaled. "You think they'll let you walk away?" Frank looked down at his hands. They were steady, but no longer clean. "No, but by then, they won't stop me. Because power isn't just taken, it's held. And sometimes, it's let go. But not until the silence has taught you how dangerous you've become, even without raising your voice." Brooklyn, June 1962. Frank Donato knew something most men in power never admitted. Every king dies twice, once when he's buried, once when he's forgotten. Joe Profaci had avoided the second death. His name still carried weight in backrooms, whispers, and quiet threats. But Frank? He wasn't interested in living long enough to find out which death would come first. He wanted something no man in his world ever truly got, a clean exit. Most men died at their peak, or just after it. A bullet in the back, a wiretap gone wrong, a jealous lieutenant with a vendetta. But Frank wasn't most men. He wasn't a murderer, not openly. He wasn't greedy, not stupidly. He didn't crave legacy, only peace. But peace doesn't live in the mafia. It visits, stays for a glass of wine, then leaves before you get comfortable. And now? Peace had stopped calling. He started laying the groundwork in silence. No announcements, no farewell dinners, no heirs. Instead, he began quietly shifting control, delegating collections to younger captains, transferring the docks to men with muscle, not mouths, letting Sal handle the political grease behind the unions. Sal noticed. Of course he did. "You're pulling back," he he said one morning, over burnt toast and bad coffee in Frank's kitchen. I'm organizing, Frank said. You're preparing to leave. Frank didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was not deniable. He spent more time at home now, more time in the garden. The tomatoes were coming in full. The soil had healed. The air didn't stink of blood anymore. One morning, Nina found him kneeling in the dirt, digging with his hands, planting basil. You're not a gardener, she said, standing over him. I was never a Don either, he replied. She smiled. But you became one. Frank didn't look up. And I'm leaving before I become something worse. The problem wasn't his exit. The problem was the world outside the exit, because the streets were watching. And when a Don steps down, the vacuum isn't slow. It rips open like a chest wound. Gallow was the first to hear about the shift. He wasn't in hiding anymore, not exactly, but he was limping around town, half respected, half forgotten, the way bad legends are. Still bitter, still loud, still alive. He laughed when he heard it. Donato's retiring, he said, spitting on the sidewalk outside an old pool hall. What's he gonna do, write a fucking cookbook? But his eyes didn't laugh, because Gallow knew the truth. When the quiet ones step away, it means the storm's about to return. Inside the family, things weren't as quiet. Leo Santarelli, one of the upstate captains Frank had trusted, began asking questions. Who's next? Why's Frank disappearing from sit-downs? Is Sal taking over? The questions didn't sound like curiosity. They sounded like positioning. Frank met Leo in a diner outside Flatbush. No guards, no entourage, just coffee, pie, and the thick air of consequences. Leo sat first, wore a new suit, cheap cologne, and the eyes of a man who thought he was just inches from power. Frank didn't touch the pie. He just stirred his coffee. You think you're next? He asked. Leo shrugged. I think the family needs strength. The next guy has to be visible, present, willing to push things forward. Frank stirred slower. And you think I'm weak? Leo didn't answer, which was the wrong answer. Frank left the diner with a simple order to Sal. Cut him off. No envelopes, no protection, no explanation. Sal raised an eyebrow. You want him gone? Frank shook his head. I want him to feel forgotten. That's worse. Within a week, Leo was a ghost. He called 5 captains. None answered. Walked into a card game. They told him the table was full. He tried to pay a cop. The cop smiled and said, Frank says hello. Then, nothing. The man vanished himself. Moved to Chicago, they said, or Jersey, maybe Florida. But no one said his name again. That was Frank's message. You don't kill your enemies. You make them disappear by removing the oxygen of power. Still, not everyone was quiet. A new name was rising. Vincent Vito Marcelli, late 30s, sharp dresser, Harvard accent but red hook bones. He wasn't old school. He didn't kiss rings unless he was stealing them. But he was respected, smart, ambitious, dangerous. Sal brought him up one night. He's got the respect of the younger earners, Frank nodded. Then he'll want more. Sal hesitated. Could be good or bad. Frank looked down at the old ledger, Joe's handwriting still visible. He tapped the page. If he asks for it, I'll know he's not ready. If he refuses it, I'll know he should have had it. Frank arranged a meeting. Private, one-on-one. Vito showed up on time, sharp suit, no entourage. They sat in the warehouse office. Same table Joe once bled across. Frank poured wine. You want to run this thing? He asked plainly. Vito sipped slow. I want it to survive, he said. Frank liked that. Even if it means being hated? Vito nodded. Especially if it means being remembered. Frank leaned back. You ever kill a man who trusted you? Vito didn't flinch. Yes? Frank smiled faintly. Good. Then you've already paid the entrance fee. But Frank didn't hand him the keys. Not yet. He needed one final confirmation, because the worst mistake any Don can make is handing power to a man who wants to be seen more than he wants to lead. So he gave Vito a task. Nothing public, nothing flashy. A whisper job, an old debt owed by a local judge in Bed-Stuy. No money involved, just influence. Frank told Vito, "Fix it, quietly." 3 days later, the judge recused himself from a federal racketeering case. No threats, no violence, just pressure. Vito never took credit. Frank watched it all in silence, then nodded to Sal. "He's the one." That night, Frank sat in the garden again. The sky was bleeding purple. The soil smelled clean. The vines were growing strong. He felt something strange in his chest, relief. The kind you don't trust. The kind that usually comes right before a bullet. Inside the house, he kissed Nina on the forehead. "I'll be home more," he said. She looked up from her book. "I don't believe you," he smiled. "Good. That means I'm still a little dangerous." But before he could leave the life behind, one thing remained. The blessing. Not from the commission, not from Sal, from the priest, from the church. From the one place Joe Profaci always returned to, even after blood soaked his hands. Frank called Father Giuliano. They sat beneath stained glass. "I'm leaving," Frank said. The priest nodded. "You ready to carry the ghosts?" "I already do." "Then go," Giuliano said softly. "But remember," he paused, then added, "God forgives men who leave hell behind, but he punishes those who go back to visit." Frank didn't answer. He just stood, shook the priest's hand, and walked out into the Brooklyn sunlight. The exit wasn't public. There were no announcements, just fewer phone calls, fewer envelopes returned, and finally, a quiet sit-down with Vito in the warehouse. Frank handed him the ring, same one Joe wore, same one he never put on. Vito held it in his hand, waited for a moment, then asked, "You really done?" Frank smiled. "No, but I'm done being seen." And just like that, the caretaker left the castle, not with a gun to his head, not with a bullet in his back, but with the silence of a man who had become the storm and now wanted the rain to stop. Brooklyn, September 1962. The city had changed. The war was over. The books were clean. The trucks ran on time. The ports were busy. And for the first time in decades, the Profaci family wasn't run by a man who had blood on his hands before breakfast. Frank Donato was gone. No headlines, no bullets, no scandal, just gone. He wasn't dead. He wasn't missing. He wasn't in witness protection. He was simply out. And that made people more nervous than any murder ever could. Because when a Don walks away without being carried, you have to wonder, what does he know that we don't? Vito Marcelli took the reins with precision. He wasn't Joe. He wasn't Frank. He wasn't trying to be either. He was the next generation, leaner, sharper, quicker to cut, but slower to burn. He made moves that were surgical. Spoke less than Frank, but moved faster than Profaci ever had. And yet, everyone still asked the same question. Where's Donato? The answer was simple, but rarely spoken. Or upstate in a 2-story farmhouse near Ithaca. A stone chimney, a crooked front porch, 2 acres of wild-growing grass, no guards, no fences, just a man, a woman, a rocking chair, and a garden that bloomed like it never knew violence. Frank Donato had become a ghost before anyone had the chance to bury him. He woke up early every morning, made his own coffee, tended the garden, read books with cracked spines and no covers. Sometimes he'd sit by the window for hours, not looking at anything, just listening to the wind move through the trees like it was whispering all the names he never said out loud. Nina asked him once, "Do you miss it?" Frank didn't turn his head. "I miss the part where no one lied to me," she waited. "And the rest?" Frank's fingers curled around the windowsill. "The rest can stay buried." But silence doesn't last forever. Not when you've carried ghosts. Not when you built your throne on the bones of the man before you. It started with a letter. Plain envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just a single piece of paper inside. One word. Help. Frank stared at it for an hour before lighting it on the stove burner. 2 days later, Sal came to visit. He showed up in a rental car, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big and sunglasses too dark for the weather. Frank met him on the porch. "You're either dying," Frank said, "or you brought bad news." Sal smirked. "Wouldn't be me if it was anything else." They sat inside. Coffee, whiskey, cigarettes, the old language of men who never forgot how to count escape routes in any room they entered. Sal leaned back. "Vito's got problems." Frank sipped, didn't ask, didn't need to. Sal explained anyway. "There's a new crew out of Jersey, ex-Gallow types, half connected. They're moving in on our Queens operations, pressuring our truck routes. There's even talk someone's trying to pull our judges off the payroll." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Talk?" Sal exhaled. "There was a shooting." Frank's hand stopped mid-sip. "Who?" Sal looked away. "Father Giuliano." The silence after that name was heavy. Frank stared at the wall for nearly a minute. "He's dead?" Sal nodded. "Shot outside the church steps, broad daylight. No message, just bullets." Frank's knuckles whitened around the glass. He was off limits. "They don't care." That night, Frank didn't sleep. He stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, holding a photo of the priest, one from years ago. A wedding blessing, smiling, peaceful. Frank poured a glass of water and dumped it out, then poured another. Because when you've been built for war, even peace tastes wrong in your mouth. Nina found him in the hallway at 3 a.m. "You're going back, aren't you?" Frank didn't answer, but his silence was louder than a yes. He returned to Brooklyn the next morning. No announcements, no motorcade, just a coat, a stare, and a name people hadn't heard in months, but hadn't dared to forget. When he walked into the olive oil warehouse, everything stopped. Forklifts, phones, conversations, even the dust in the air felt like it paused. Vito was waiting. He stood when Frank entered, respectfully, cautiously. "I didn't ask for you to come," he said. Frank nodded. "I didn't come for you." Vito held the stare. "You think I can't handle it?" Frank looked around the room. "No, I think you will handle it. I'm just here to remind them that someone still remembers how." Together they went to the church. Small funeral, quiet turnout, no press, no suits, just old hands and bowed heads. Frank stood at the back, never stepped to the casket. He didn't cry, but his jaw stayed tight the entire time. Sal stood beside him. "They'll want you to stay," he whispered. Frank didn't blink. "That's why I won't." After the funeral, Frank made one visit, not to an enemy, not to a captain, but to a boy. Paulie Bellino's son, now a man, 22, wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit, working under a Buick in a garage near Williamsburg. Frank waited until he stood up, covered in grease. The kid froze. Frank reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded card, the King of Hearts, torn and re-taped. He handed it over without a word. The kid opened it. Inside was one line. "You get one shot. Don't waste it." Then Frank walked away. Because the past doesn't belong to kings. It belongs to the ones who survive them. That night, Frank left Brooklyn again. Sal drove him to the city limits. Neither man spoke. When they reached the crossroads, Sal stopped the car. "You sure you won't stay?" Frank looked out the window. "They already buried Profaci once. I don't want them burying me twice." Sal smirked. "You're still scary, you know that?" Frank finally smiled. "Good. That means I did it right." Back in Ithaca, he returned to his chair, his garden, his quiet. But not all of him returned. Something stayed behind in Brooklyn, a phantom of the man he had been, walking dark alleys, sitting at corner tables, watching over an empire that still whispered his name. Because in the end, the best bosses aren't remembered by their bloodshed. They're remembered by what they left behind. And what Frank left behind was silence. A silence that taught men to measure their words, question their greed, and fear the day a ghost decided to put his coat back on. Epilogue. Vito Marcelli held the family strong for a decade. Clean books, cold hands, warm respect. He ruled well because he ruled in the shadow of two men, Joe Profaci, the killer with rosary beads in his pocket, and Frank Donato, the ghost who taught a generation how to walk without making noise. And sometimes, late at night, a young soldier, drunk or bold, would ask, Did Donato ever come back? And the older ones would smile, shake their heads. No, they'd say, but he doesn't need to, because he never really left.